Andy Burnham has been confirmed as the Labour Party's candidate for the Makerfield by-election, you might have noticed. And since he announced his intention to stand in the seat last week, one word has accompanied his candidacy. And should he win, his premiership. No, it's not eyelashes. They are very long, aren't they? That word is Manchesterism. Now, you might associate that word historically with classical liberalism, Cobden, John Bright, free trade, the Manchester School of Economics. But now it seems to mean, well, we're not actually that sure. An essay in The New Statesman by Matt Lawrence, friend of the show, sought to explain the concept, making clear why it and PM Burnham adopting it would represent a potential break with the economic orthodoxy of the last 40 years. Earlier today, I spoke to Matt, and I started by asking him what the term Manchesterism even means.
Manchesterism is a response to a set of compounding crises that no one has been able to resolve. So an affordability crisis, economic stagnation, crisis of public finances. And there are many causes for that. So it might be austerity, it might be external shocks. Think of COVID, think of the Iran or the sort of Ukrainian wars. But actually, there's this underlying cause of why we can't get out of this trap, which is that essentials, so housing, energy, transport, care, these essentials that everyone uses are too expensive, too scarce, and too volatile. And a fundamental cause of that, not the only reason, but a fundamental cause of that is the sustained retreat of public provision, public investment, and public control and ownership of those foundational sectors. And if we want to address that, we need to recognize that that transformation, privatization, and marketization of essential services has built an economy that extracts where it should invest, it fragments where it should coordinate, and it prices for profit when it should produce for need. And so Manchesterism is this idea of saying, actually, returning to public control, whether that's direct public ownership, public provision, the public as an actor in a market, is fundamental to getting control of the cost of those essentials, which is important not just for affordability and living standards, but also sort of for Britain's fiscal position. And if we don't do that, we'll always be running up an uphill escalator, or downhill escalator as it may be, in which these upward pressures on prices of affordability, the lack of affordable housing is going to keep sort of compounding. And so Manchesterism, or the productive state, really is this framework of saying, to fix that, it's not enough just to rely on the welfare state. It's not enough just to liberalize the planning system. You actually need the state in different forms, whether it's sort of municipal, regional, whether it's sort of Westminster, to directly act in markets again, whether it's direct investment, whether it's direct shaping of markets. And that is how we address the affordability crisis over the long term. It's about addressing the supply side dysfunction so we can fix the foundations so that we can have a more dynamic middle of the economy and a really vibrant frontier in terms of innovation at the top.
So Andy Burnham's been quite clear in his tweets replying to people saying, look, I believe the state can do good things. I believe in public services, but that doesn't make me anti-business. And I think you've just touched on that there. Before we get to the roots of why it's been called Manchesterism, because I think you're outlining a really interesting social democratic response to these crises, which again, I think they're indisputable. But before we get to that, where would you stand on a wealth tax? Because you're talking about the essentials of life being too expensive. So housing, energy, transport, etc. That means greater state involvement, being a market maker. But does it also mean actually getting on top of the rentier class? Because of course, if you have something like a wealth tax, and that means they pour less of their money into, asset managers, which means that less of that money is then poured into buying privatized utilities, etc. Is there a tax element to it as well that really goes after the very rich?
So there is. I think this is about tackling that rentierism in the economy that extracts and doesn't, and it's about production. But I think we should recognize that a wealth tax, even the sort of more upper tier estimates, doesn't really raise sort of that much. And obviously its role might be sort of to discipline. But actually this is about saying, let's be about production. Let's produce affordable council housing at scale. Let's build clean public power at scale. Let's think about public transport networks to connect cities. And that goes back to your question of is this anti-business? No, it's quite the opposite. At the moment, we have an economy in which the foundations and the fundamentals are too scarce, too expensive, and too volatile. And that is not the foundation in which people can thrive, but nor is it a foundation in which businesses can build, because demand is stagnant and because supply is dysfunctional. Unless you get on top of that, you're always going to be trying to build an economy on weak foundations, and weak foundations are not the secure, stable base for forms of abundance that I think we should be aiming for.
Super fascinating. And I personally am very sympathetic to this argument of it being a progressive but also pro-business sort of politics and framework. Some people might not like to hear that. They might say, well, screw business. I mean, you're welcome to think that, but I think empirically it's very evident that the last 15 years haven't really worked for anybody but the very wealthiest in our society. So to go back to my point that I made a few minutes ago, I get it as a social democratic offer. It's a bit different to Starmerism. It's a bit different to basically what the Labour Party has offered in this country for a really long time, including in some ways Jeremy Corbyn. Why Manchesterism? Because there's no doubt Manchester has done very well in recent years, particularly under Mayor Andy Burnham. But some people would say, including some of my colleagues here at Novara Media, that's not because of anything he did, but because they were given greater powers by George Osborne of all people, because of effectively the city council, the greater region being a one-party state for 30, 40 years. They would say, Matt Lawrence, the reason why Manchester has done so well is because actually its politics look more like Singapore, enlightened autocracy and Labour managerialism, the very thing that Burnham is now rallying against. What would you say to that?
So I think let's take that in broad sweep. So the vision is about a foundation which is secure and which are essentially sort of affordable, a dynamic middle in which sort of workers as well as sort of enterprise can actually be dynamic and be rewarded for their labor and rewarded for their efforts and sort of their work, and then a sort of advanced frontier. And Manchesterism, I think the example that speaks to that is the B network. Now, we shouldn't sort of overplay it, but nonetheless, it is a really instructive example. Not necessarily, it's not radical, it's just common sense that says rather than having a deregulated, outsourced, fragmented transport sector, we will coordinate these and bring it under public control, not even public ownership, but public control. And the benefits are very clear to see. Fares have fallen by 15%, ridership is up, new services are opening, and that is only really because of the return of public control rather than this fragmented, outsourced, privately controlled system. Now, of course, it's the success of Manchester. Success has many fathers, defeat has, as an orphan. But so of course, yes, it's partly about a financialized growth model. It's partly about the scaling in of capital into that growth model. And I think that brings lots of challenges. So the argument is not, well, let's choose, sort of that element to run with that. It's about saying, actually, you have to fix the fundamentals. It's about the expansion of public provision of those essentials. And if you don't fix those foundations, you will struggle to build a dynamic market economy, let alone a progressive left economy. And so that is really about why the Manchesterism argument is there. And frankly, it's also because Andy Burnham has said this. He has said this, for example, in his New Statesman article in September of last year, where he said very clearly, public control of essential services is both an affordability thing. It's how you bear down on costs that people are really struggling to get by with. But it's also a kind of fiscal prudence argument. It's saying if we don't get on top of those core costs, what you essentially see is more and more pressure on public spending to make up for the dysfunction of market scarcity and market underprovision.
On the specifics of how this might work, if Andy Burnham becomes the next prime minister, there's a lot of ifs, buts, and maybes. He needs to win a by-election first. He would need to contest that leadership, potentially even against Keir Starmer. But if he got into number 10 Downing Street, he says, I agree with everything Matt Lawrence wrote in this superb article for the New Statesman. It has entirely identified the theory with which I wish to govern. That sounds great. But then I look at his potential head of policy, which is now being touted as Josh Simons, formerly with Labour Together. Are you worried that this agenda, which to me sounds like a sensible, soft left agenda with some radical elements to it, are you worried that because of the personnel in and around the Labour Party, in and around Andy Burnham, that it won't really go anywhere? That what they're doing with these ideas, many of which come from people like yourself, about public control, abundance, a supply side politics from the left, that actually this is just window dressing by these people so they can rebuild consent for a failing Labour Party and actually not deliver very much. Does that worry you?
Because I think in a way, divorce from personality, divorce even from Andy Burnham, this is about developing a coherent response to the problems that are driving our politics, which is unaffordability, it's a crisis in the housing market, it's a crisis in the basics, in the sense that things just don't really work anymore. And in a way, what we can kind of do on the wide left is to say, we are developing arguments that are coherent, persuasive, transformative, and answer the real material needs of people, and in doing so can expand the real realm of freedom. This is about providing the basics affordably with security, and ultimately, sort of sending the essay, it's about thinking how can we sort of change the relationship between market, citizen, and state, expand decommodification, challenge the empire of necessity to build real freedom. Now that is a big political argument. As a big political argument, in a way, like that is the political stakes rather than kind of personality-driven things. And clearly, if Andy Burnham became prime minister and wanted to pursue this agenda, fantastic. But I think in a way, the challenge for all of us is to build the demands. And I think that the thing I would say is a politics of public provision, and this is actually Mamdani Senior in a way, rather, and his son is putting it into practice in New York. But the politics of public provision is actually how you rebuild the sort of engines of solidarity that are constitutive of left politics and success. The market settlement for essentials fragments, it divides, it turns you against, what you can afford is your place in society, rather than as a political community we're going to provide. And therefore, there's that civic universalism, and what binds us together is that we share these fundamentals. And therefore, that paradox of redistribution, in which, actually, the more you residualize things, the worse things get. Actually, a more expansive, progressive vision of public provision is how you show real benefits for ordinary people. It's how you tackle these sort of fiscal and macro pressures, which no doubt Britain faces. There are real constraints, real trade-offs. This has to be sequenced. But you can build a political economy that you can reconstitute a progressive base, regardless of political party, and actually answer some of these fundamental challenges that for the last 30 to 40 years, Britain has either ignored or has not had any answers to.
That was Matt Lawrence speaking to me earlier today. I thought his first answer was really clear about what it was. I've seen some jokes on X saying, what is Manchesterism? Is it the Hacienda and Oasis and craft beer? Obviously not according to Matt Lawrence anyway. Are you convinced about Manchesterism, Michael Walker?
I think the argument that Matt is making is coherent, and it's a sort of interesting program for government, which is to say we're going to focus on the supply side, and we can actually increase government involvement in the economy without it increasing overall borrowing or taxation, because what that will allow us to do is push down costs. At the moment, sort of the state has many obligations, to house people who are vulnerable, but it doesn't have its own resources to fulfill those obligations. So the way to cut costs whilst being, humane is not to say let's reduce the obligations that the state has, but let's sort of put ourselves in a better position to meet those without relying on rentiers. I think that's all smart. I do think that Manchester, and it's very similar to Andy Burnham, sort of, they're very easy objects for people to project their own desires and prejudices and ideas onto. So people can look at Andy Burnham and say, oh, he's this brilliant soft left figure, he's going to be beautiful. Or, if you're Josh Simons, you can look at Andy Burnham and saying he's actually a sensible. He's put forward an image which is potentially attractive to the left, but ultimately, he's a Blairite. Both of these things, you can look at Andy Burnham, you can look at Manchester, and you can see what you want to see.
He's a cipher, is what you're saying.
He's a cipher, yeah. And Manchester is a cipher at the moment in this period of political debate. So let's look at sort of the Manchester model. I can't claim to be an expert. I'm going to try and speak to some experts over the next couple of weeks. But sort of from what I've been reading today. So Manchester's population fell from 750,000 in 1931 to 400,000 by 2001. So this was, we look at it now, this sort of image of success and vibrancy. It was another one of those cities that had massive post-industrial decline. It was called Gunchester. There were documentaries about Manchester being Gunchester in the early 2000s. Of course, also Manchester. So it's often actually the case that when a city is in decline, you get some of the most vibrant and interesting cultural artistic movements because, if you haven't got much employment, people can do interesting things. You've got big empty buildings. People can have raves and all sorts of interesting things. So it wasn't all bad, but people were leaving. There weren't so many jobs, right? Then, this is a crazy fact, actually, before I go on. So this I had to double check because I thought it doesn't sound true, but it's from the BBC, which is, our organisation of record. The resident population in Manchester city centre in 1990 was 500 people. I mean, there was office blocks, presumably, and the like. It's now 100,000. So that's a crazy transformation, 500 to 100,000. Now, maybe that was a BBC journalist sort of being a bit loose of it, but as far as I can tell, that's correct. So how did they do it? How did they regenerate this city in a way which has had downsides? It's probably harder to have a really vibrant music scene, because I'm sure rents have gone up massively. That's what happens when a city grows. But also it's a place where more people want to live instead of leave. So as you said, you mentioned there sort of the idea that this technocracy that's been in power for a very long time. Richard Lees, probably more significant than Andy Burnham in terms of the current state of Manchester. That's because he was the council leader, the elected Labour council leader for 25 years, 1996 to 2021. That's a kind of continuity you're not going to see anywhere else in the country. And the chief exec, so that's the main sort of bureaucrat appointed by Richard Lees. He was chief exec of Manchester from 1998 to 2017. Now, these were people who, it seems, they present themselves as not particularly ideological, very pragmatic. So you do have sort of some very important public infrastructure, the metro system, cheap, effective. That involves a lot of state infrastructure. You've got Burnham's B network, so that's obviously sort of public provision, even if it is under, to some degree, private control. But one of the big reasons that Manchester has, I suppose, more money now to play with, you need money if you want to do social provisions, is because they have built shed loads of buildings, which has facilitated this massive rise in population. So the population has risen by 30% since 2000. And Richard Lees has been very sort of explicit that he has done this by inviting foreign direct investment and inviting developers to build for profit. So critics of Richard Lees have said, there was barely any affordable housing in any of these buildings. He said, if I demanded affordable housing, they wouldn't have built them. So it's better to have them built than to get no affordable housing. So that's very controversial among lots of people. But the story of Manchester seems to me to be not just business friendly, sort of very reliant on private capital to build as much as possible to facilitate a growth of population with jobs which would be developed, media city, finance, professional services, with some important public provision of public transport. So it's not... That's
not kind of Blairism, right? That's Blairism.
Yeah.
Financialization, development with regards to property, commerce, and then there'll be a few crumbs and we can give that to people with public infrastructure and welfare, etc.
I mean, quite possibly, yeah. I mean, I suppose with Blairism, you would say the problem with that is that all this capital and people goes to Manchester, and what about everywhere else? You'd say Manchester was one of the winners of Blairism, and there are actually lots of losers of Blairism. So you could say it's not necessarily a vindication of Blairism, because if Manchester's a winner, somewhere else has to be a loser. But I certainly don't think you can look at the success of Manchester and say, oh, this is because they did municipal socialism. And I think building out a whole ideology from a bus network,
a very good bus network.
A very good bus network. I mean, it's the same model as London's bus network. We a big problem with Britain is that London has had much better provision than the rest of the country. So it's not to say, well, who cares? London's had this for ages. The big injustice in the country was that London had a brilliant public transport system and nowhere else did, because they'd been privatized and deregulated. And you had sort of 3 different brands of buses going down the same route, all charging slightly different fees. It was crazy having that not under public control. And absolutely, Burnham is right to sort of celebrate that and champion that. Whether or not that makes a vision for an entire political economy of a country, I'm slightly less convinced.
Michael Walker's main criticism of Manchesterism and Andy Burnham is that it should be called TFLism.
I'll get cancelled for that. Come on.
TFLism.
So, I don't know what they're talking about. London did this already.
But you're right that it's politically smart to focus your messaging around a northern city, mixed economy. You can be pro-business to some people, pro-state to others, future-oriented. It's good to be associated with success. Manchester has been a rare success story in this country over the last 15 years. I suppose there's 2 reads on it, right? One is it's kind of like Blairism, like we said, which is you're pro-business, you're pro-market, and there's some surplus, and that goes to some people. There's another read, which is, you're pro-business, you're pro-FDI, but actually it's about public control, right? And that was a word that Matthew used there. And core to Blairism was the idea that actually public control is always bad and that the market's always good with regards to provision of public services. Not always, but almost always. And even that, if that's now the centre of the Labour Party, if the Labour Party is not going to go any further right than that, that does feel like quite a big shift nonetheless.
I mean, definitely celebrating it does. I think what Andy Burnham is offering, the pitch of Manchesterism, is different to New Labour.
100% right.
He's saying that ownership matters, he's saying that control matters, which is different from New Labour. But looking at Manchester as an actually existing city, I think beyond the bus network, and again, I don't claim to be an expert, beyond the bus network, it doesn't strike me as a city where the state has an enormous amount of control over the provision of very much.